right, welcome to another episode of Tales from the Dragon's Library. If you have not been with us before, this is the show, or sort of a podcast slash interactive audiobook. I'm working on, or I finished a novel, and I'm working through another round of edits, and I feel like I may wind up having to self-publish. So I wanted to sort of motivate myself to get through the edits, to get through the whole book, and I also wanted an idea. I thought this would be a cool idea for a new show. I actually saw this idea from another author at Gen Con. Let me move a window over here so I can see what's going on. I saw this from another author at Gen Con, and unfortunately I don't remember his name, but he did this and had a lot of success with it, so I thought I'd try it too. I've had a few of you guys stop by. You did enjoy the show and gave some feedback. I can't say I'll take all feedback. Obviously, this is my book. It's got to be written in my voice and things like that. But if you do notice anything completely off or out of the ordinary, just doesn't make sense, be sure, throw something in the chat. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you're having fun. I also like to talk to you guys and everything else. If you are new to this particular book, it is a political story. It's a sort of a dystopian political thriller. Maybe not so much thriller, but there is a lot of heavy politics in here from both sides of everything. This is not a targeted book at any one ideology. Though there is some distinct criticisms of things like socialism and whatnot. So just so you know that it is a political book. It is also, I would call it, it's not like a real adult book, but it does have some moderate adult themes. So keep that in mind as well. It's up to you, whatever you prefer to read. We are on chapter 27. The family and their friends who have left Stewart, Illinois, are now in Missouri. They're over by Mark Twain Lake now, actually just west of Mark Twain Lake. So if you are familiar with that area, you'll know where they're at. I did use Google Maps to sort of lay out the real path that these people walk as they try to make their way from Illinois to Oklahoma. Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico being the only states that seceded from the Union in this particular timeline, and where people can go to be free. It is sort of like the last bastion, the last shining example of freedom left, and that's where these people are going. So I'm not going to rehash too much. You can watch past episodes if you want to know what's going on. I'll also post a link to the online version of this book, which has not been edited, that you can read if you want to catch up or read ahead. Entirely up to you. So we're going to jump into chapter 27. Each chapter begins with an excerpt from John's journal. John Everman is our protagonist, our main character, along with his family and his friends. Also, if you are watching on Frags and Beer Live, the page is screwed up. Do be sure to, you can, I'm not sure. It's really screwed up. I need to look at something's goofy with the themes going on. I need to figure out how to uninstall and reinstall a theme, but something is messed up on the site if you are watching on Frags and Beer, so bear that in mind. All right, so we're going to jump right in here and make sure everything's running. Okay, good. Hopefully you guys can hear me. What I do want to hear, I don't have my headset on, so I want to make sure. Yeah, sound is coming through. Fantastic. Okay. All right, we're going to start. I remember a newspaper article some years ago that has stuck with me since I read it. It was one of those signs that our society had dived right off the cliff of sanity. A man killed his entire family in their sleep and then himself. Some part of him just broke one night, and he ended everything with a pipe wrench. It was a terrible event, but it didn't end there. After they found his body in the basement, they found his suicide note. The man blamed his boss for harassing him at work, and the baker for cheating him on his bread ration. He said he couldn't watch his family starve anymore. Would you believe the feds arrested his boss and the baker? They said that the family would be alive today if those two hadn't driven the man to murder. I believe both of them went to prison as accessories. I remember my father talking about individual responsibility more than once. He said that you only have yourself to blame for your mistakes. I guess we lost that somewhere along the way. So John's beliefs are very firm with what his father and his grandfather taught him about individual liberty, individual responsibility, and the world that they live in now just doesn't jive well with that particular belief set. So now we are with the group of people that have crossed the bridge west of Mark Twain Lake after running from the feds all night. And we are with Amanda, John's wife. Amanda sat in the middle of the little living room of the house the refugees were hiding in. She hadn't slept at all after making sure Todd and the others were settled in. From time to time she looked around at her friends and neighbors sleeping around her. Some found blankets in the house and had given them to the oldest members of their group to share. Most were sleeping in their coats with their bags held close or under their heads for pillows. So many people clutching at the remnants of their lives and running toward the hope of something better. Mostly she stared out at the window near the front door. Her treasures were not near enough to clutch to her chest. John was still out there in the woods somewhere, or in the hands of the feds. Her children were in a van somewhere between her and Texas, and she could only pray that they made it there. She can only pray that they made it there safely. I'm going to take that out because that's a clumsy phrase. She can only pray they made it there safely. No reason to put there in there. Made it safely. She'd stared at the window through the night, hoping that John would make it in time. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to do what needed to be done, but she would do it. Her last promise to John had been to get as many of their friends to Texas as she could, and for her to get to their children. She noticed the sky outside was gray instead of black, and wondered how long it had been so. She didn't remember the light changing, but the sun was rising, and it was time to get the group moving. Some began to stir on their own, either already awake or so used to the sleep schedule they woke on their own. Others were nudged into wakefulness by Amanda. And some began to stir, either already awake or so used to the sleep schedule they woke on their own. Others were nudged into wakefulness by Amanda. Everyone was packing their blankets back into their bags and securing anything they had removed during the night. Several cast looks at Amanda or looked around the group as if trying to spot someone. Todd crouched close and helped Amanda fold her blanket. "He'll catch up," Todd said softly, knowing what had been on her mind all night. She nodded, trying to look optimistic. "I know." Right, changing scenes. John was exhausted by the time the sky started to lighten. He was sore and bruised from falling, and his clothes were heavy with mud and moisture. He hadn't slept at all, having run all night along the bank of the lake. His hazardous run in the dark had been a lucky one. Despite all of his falls, he had not broken or twisted anything. He was sure someone was watching out for him, and he was grateful. More than once he whispered a thankful prayer after a fall that didn't kill him, or barely dodging a tree that might have knocked him senseless. He finally stumbled out of the woods near the bridge that crossed the last waterway between him and the cabin. Wasn't a cabin. His people would have hid in. He finally stumbled out of the woods near the bridge that crossed the last waterway between him and the house his people would have hid in. I don't like that sentence. It's a bit clumsy. Finally stumbled out of the woods near the bridge everyone had crossed the night before. He finally stumbled out of the woods near the bridge everyone had crossed the night before. Yeah, that makes more sense. We don't need had in there. Everyone crossed the night before. I have a bad habit of putting that in there, and a lot of new writers do. A lot of old writers do. You don't need had and that. Those two words aren't. We overuse them. I'm trying to cut back, but it's really challenging. It becomes a habit. If you write without thinking about it, it becomes a habit because a lot of us talk that way. The sun was nearly over the trees in the east, and he knew his friend should already be on the road. Tired as he was, he put his head down and pushed himself into a steady jog, gritting his teeth at the pain in his legs. His side ached, but he kept going, knowing his only chance of catching up was to not stop. The house, it's not a cabin, was a short distance up the road from the bridge and in the trees on the south side of the road highway. He hoped they didn't leave too early, and he might catch them as the access road met the... He might catch them soon. The pavement stretched ahead of him, seeming to go on forever. He couldn't help but imagine that his whole life would be like that. In fact, he hoped his life would be. He hoped that he would always be moving forward, looking to a horizon that held a mysterious future. His previous life had just been the same day over and over. He always knew where he would go, what he would be doing, and that he would do it all over again the next day. Okay, so hold on. He always knew where he would go, what he would be doing, and that he would be doing it all over again the next day. Where his past seemed to be one long gray day, his future was slowly taking on all the color he could imagine. Even their last few days on the road, as hard as they had been, were far better than the life he left behind. He just hoped everyone else felt that way. He hoped Steve had felt that way before he died on this journey. John crossed the bridge as fast as he could, disliking the exposure of the raised pavement. If anyone were on the highway or happened to fly over in a search plane, he would be spotted easily enough. The burning need to reach his friends overrode his instinct to stay hidden, however. He was across the bridge in no time at all, and veered off the highway toward the trees on the south side. He could see in his mind the map of the area they had all studied, and knew where the house was in relation to the road. He could make a straight line through the trees and get there faster than going all the way down to the access road. Stepping off the road at the speed he was running proved to be a mistake. John misjudged the steepness of the embankment on the side of the highway, and his foot met the ground a lot harder than he expected. His knee collapsed under the weight of his body, and he pitched forward down the hill. He rolled and bounced the short distance, the side of his face connecting with something hard before coming to rest in the wet ditch at the bottom. Alright. How is everybody today? Anybody watching? Alright, so Amanda was packed and ready, waiting outside the house for the rest of the group. It was becoming increasingly difficult to get everyone up and moving in the mornings, especially that one. After the harrowing flight from the feds the day before and the hours running through the woods, everyone was exhausted. We do need a comma there, I think. She was anxious to get moving, but a small part of her was thankful for the delay. She felt like every moment they waited increased her chances of seeing John again. She had no idea if he had made it or if he was captured, but she had faith that he was free and on his way to the house. She'd prayed most of the sleepless night and was confident that he was safe. She just didn't know how far behind he was. While they waited, Todd and a couple others were going over a map of Missouri, planning the next leg of their journey. She listened idly as they talked about the route south toward a little town called Moberly. They were discussing the possibility of having to go around it. From there, they would follow an old state highway south. They also talked about the next river crossing that would come during the second day out from where they were. The only place to cross on their route was a town marked Boonville. It would be tricky crossing for so many people, but until they saw the bridge and town, they wouldn't be able to plan much in detail. While Amanda listened, she alternated between watching the house where the last few people were getting ready and looking back toward the highway for any sign of John. When the last person exited the little house, everyone started walking toward the highway. The group would follow it, staying in the trees as much as they could until they reached Moberly, which was close to a day's walk west. Amanda got everyone organized and reminded them to stick together and stay out of sight of the highway. We used highway like 3 times in that sentence. She took one last look back to the east and froze. A small gasp escaped her lips. We don't need a comma there. Those close enough to hear her turned at the sound, and a moment of excited panic brought everyone to a halt. They all watched as a lone figure exited the tree line to the east. He was limping and covered in mud and grass, making him unrecognizable. Some of the group whispered that it was one of the feds and they should run before more showed up. Others were filled with hope that it might be John, who most expected never to see again. I don't need that rest of that sentence. Amanda had no such doubts and didn't need to see the figure with her eyes to know who it was. The set of his broad shoulders, the way he held himself in reserved confidence, and the tired but relieved smile that split the muddy face was all she needed. "John," she whispered before running toward him. The single word poured out all the stress and anguish she had been feeling for days. With that release, it was as if her entire body had been a coiled spring waiting for someone to release it. She flew into his arms, heedless of the mud that covered him. He braced himself as he wrapped his arms around her to keep his twisted leg from collapsing and accepting her hard kisses on his bruised face. She felt as if she had come home after an eternity lost in the night and realized that was truer now than ever before. Along with their children, John was home, especially since they were all a people with no place to call their own. She sighed and closed her eyes, taking a moment to feel everything she had expected to never feel again until the moment she saw him. She didn't want to let go, but knew she would have to. "We should move," he said softly after a time, releasing Amanda from his embrace. He looked around at the gathered friends and smiled, all smiling and excited. "We need to get moving," he said more loudly. "John, you're hurt. We can rest here another day," Amanda said. A few others nodded, but most still looked scared at the prospect of being caught. "I'll manage. We can't wait any longer." He was firm, and Amanda knew he would not stop for just himself. She put her shoulder under his arm, picked up her pack, and the two of them led the group west toward Moberly. Pretty proud of that scene, actually, because when I wrote this book, I would finish a chapter and I would give it to my wife to read. Just sort of to get initial reaction ideas and see what she thought. Did I touch base with everything? Did I forget, plot thread? Did I leave out characters and things like this? So she watched for all those little inconsistencies. And that scene, when she got done reading that scene, she was crying. And to me, when an author can create an actual physical, emotional reaction, that's a pretty big deal. Like I've read probably more than 1,200, 1,500 books in my life, and that's not counting the comic books I've read, which number in the 4,000 range or something like that. But very few books have ever caused me to tear up or laugh out loud or feel anxious or excited. And so when words on a page, when I can cause that kind of emotional reaction, I'm pretty proud of that, because that to me is a pretty big accomplishment for an author. So when she returned those pages to me with tears in her eyes and told me how that made her feel, I was pretty excited about that. Not that I, wanted to make my wife cry, but I caused a reaction, which, I knew it was a pretty big deal. It's not something that happens often. Not a lot of writers can get that much emotion out of just words on a page. That scene, I'm pretty proud of that scene. I think I'm going to like that scene in my book probably forever. All right, so chapter 28. There's a quote from the Declaration of Independence that I've always loved. Let's fix this. I've always loved. All experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. That basically means we become comfortable and don't like to rock the boat lightly. We will tolerate quite a lot of injustice before we do anything about it. In most cases, this is a good thing, a survival instinct. In other cases, it is what has allowed so many populations over the course of human history to become slaves. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. This chapter heading, this excerpt actually is very much something that I believe, and I put this in here because of that, because I thought this is definitely one of the spots where mine and John's beliefs would become the same. That quote right out of the Declaration of Independence is probably hardly anybody quotes that, but I think it's one of the most important quotes in the Declaration of Independence, because it most accurately describes human nature. We will put up with a lot before we go out of our way to make a major change in our lives. If you don't like, say you go to McDonald's for breakfast every day, and let's say every 10th day they mess up your breakfast. You are very likely to keep going there because you don't want to change your routine for an inconvenience every once in a while. Now, if they messed it up 3 times a week, you would be more likely to make a change. That becomes more pronounced as you get into things like societies and government, where change is difficult. Not only difficult, but that kind of change can have a major impact on people's lives. That whole quote, that whole portion of the Declaration of Independence basically was saying that America had put up with a lot for a long time from the British government. The British government treated the people who lived in the colonies like garbage for a long time. Like, you're talking, what did we land here in the mid 1400s, and we didn't write this until in the 1700s, 1770s. Because I don't think it right at it might have been. Sorry, I'm foggy on my specific dates, but you're talking 250, 300 years that people in America were treated like garbage by their government, which was across the ocean, and we put up with it for that long before we finally said enough is enough, and we told Britain to go screw yourself. People will put up with things for a long time before they will completely alter their lives, and take that risk of altering their lives. And unfortunately, a lot of times that's how human beings have become slaves to either their government or other government entities or foreign powers, because they became complacent and they didn't want change, and those powers slowly changed things to the point where the people could not change it, could not abolish it, could not take it back. So this is an important, to me, in this day and age, this is a very important thing for us to keep in mind and to remember and to realize that we cannot allow ourselves to be enslaved because of the nature of humanity's nature to put up with shit. We just can't let that happen. So that's an important quote, and sorry to get sidetracked in it, sort of an explanation of why I wrote that and why I think that's important. But I just wanted to share why I think that's important. Lieutenant Casey drove into Moberly late in the morning after the failed attempt to capture the fugitives. Remember, and you may not remember, Lieutenant Casey is who's the federal agent who's charged with capturing these people and bringing them back, or keeping them from escaping and emigrating into Texas. He had dogs and he had patrol officers and he had help trying to catch them the night before, and some of them reached overtime. Their contracts keep them from working too many hours. They lost the search dogs to a politician's daughter went missing, so the search dogs were called to that, which was deemed more important. So Casey is now again on his own trying to stop these fugitives. We have 55 minus the children, Benny and Sarah, who are in the van moving, and well, some of the older people moving west. So let's say we have about 30 to 35 people that Casey is charged with single-handedly stopping from leaving the country. But he is dedicated to his task, despite, he could also shrug it off and say, well, I've reached overtime and I'm going to go home, and he could do that according to the laws of this universe that we've created here. So he drove into Moberly late in the morning after the failed attempt to capture the fugitives. It had once been a decently sized Midwestern town, but many of the residents had been relocated to federal farms, leaving only the factory workers and those who ran the federal stores. It was the same story in just about every detail. It was the same story in just about every small town across the country. People were relocated, workers consolidated, and national businesses merged. Casey suspected that in another generation or two, all of these towns would be empty. Casey pulled the SUV over and took in the scene for a few minutes while he considered his next move. Moberly still had just enough activity to make it appear to be a bustling town. People were going about their daily work, cutting lawns around occupied houses, cleaning up trash and fallen leaves, and all the general work that one would expect to find early in the day in any town in the country. Casey looked on the scene, and the sense of order gave him a sense of... And the order... Hold on... of it all gave him a sense of comfort. Everyone moved in a single-minded sense of everyone moved with a single-minded purpose. No one stood and conversed on the streets. No one called greetings from yard to yard or between people passing on the road, on the sidewalks. Let's do that. Every occupied house and business had a new American flag flying out front or on the pole overhead. There were few cars, and most of the ones that were moving about around the town belonged to government officials. Every town in the country seemed to have more government officials than average citizens. Business and residential inspectors, federal police, and compliance officers seemed to be needed for just about everything that went on in any little town. Casey saw a few children at play and marveled at the one constant in the world. No matter how things were, how good or bad, or how much their parents were affected by events around them, children always seemed to find the drive to play. Maybe that was why they always seemed to be referred to as a sign of hope for the future. Casey decided his first stop would be the federal law enforcement office in Moberly. He needed to check in and brief the local officers of what was coming their way. He expected them to have already heard about the large group of fugitives moving west, but news wasn't always up to date when the government media was involved. Not that Casey was surprised. If the general public knew about how far the fugitives had gotten, it might inspire others to try the same thing. The government couldn't afford a mass exodus of citizens. The drive through town was short and uneventful. The federal police office was just like every other in the country. It was a short, square, featureless building with a few small windows across the front and double glass doors in the middle of the wall facing the street. Casey knew the back of the building would have garage access, a loading dock, and a heavy steel door for access. He entered the front doors that opened into a simple lobby with a reception desk and a few chairs for waiting. The air had a sterile smell and was cooled to the uniform 75 degrees. Even a country focused on the environment couldn't give up every luxury. Call that a luxury, 75 degrees. 75 is hot for me. I need to see the officer on duty, Casey said to the agent behind the desk, the only other person in the lobby. The lieutenant set his credentials on the desk as he spoke. In his office, first door on the right, the receptionist thumbed down the hall after looking at Casey's badge. We'll make that badge. Or Casey's ID. Let's do that. Casey walked down the hall toward the back of the building and knocked on the door marked duty officer and entered without waiting for a reply. An overweight man, sergeant by the rank on his uniform, sergeant by the insignia on his uniform, shot to his feet the moment he recognized the higher-ranking officer. A half-eaten sandwich lay on the desk next to a cup of coffee. Does that really need to be hyphenated? I don't think that needs to be hyphenated. Lieutenant, what can I do for you? The sergeant asked, obviously surprised. He glanced at the door nervously like he expected more people to come in. Relax, Sergeant, I'm alone. This isn't an inspection, Casey said, sitting down across from the sergeant. The other officer noted... let's fix that here. Sitting down in the chair. The other officer noticeably relaxed and took his seat again. Once he knew he wasn't going to be audited, he lost the pretense of formality. He offered Casey a cup of coffee, but the lieutenant waved it off. We have a problem, Sergeant. I suppose you've seen the news, Casey asked. The fugitives? Yeah, that little... What little the Fed news has... Hold on. Stumbling over the sentences. The fugitives? Yeah, what little the Fed news has made public, the sergeant said. Central hasn't sent more than that, Casey asked. He should be surprised, but he wasn't. The sergeant shook his head. Well, consider this your briefing. What I am about to tell you is not for public consumption, Casey said. The sergeant nodded and leaned back, eager for some real news. Casey filled him in about the events since the exodus from Stewart. Now, if he's eager, hold on a second, nodded and leaned forward. An eager person leans forward to listen. Casey filled him in about the events since the exodus from Stewart. He left out information the officer didn't need, especially the setbacks. He made sure the sergeant had no doubts that a large group of people were headed toward Moberly, and Casey was going to need help stopping them. I don't have a lot of manpower here, Lieutenant. We'll do what we can, of course, but you're talking about apprehending quite a few people, the sergeant said. Could we enlist some of the citizens to help? Casey asked. Maybe. The sergeant seemed to shift uncomfortably. I'll see what I can do on that front. Casey thought it was odd behavior, but he tucked the thought away for another day. He simply nodded and stood up, determined to have a look around the town and devise a plan to stop the fugitives with only a handful of questionable assistants. I'm going to get the lay of the land. It'll be hours. Nope, don't scroll. It'll be hours before they get this far, but I believe they'll come through here, Casey said. The sergeant stood as Casey turned to leave. Do you want someone to ride with you? The sergeant asked, seeming nervous again. No, I can find my way around on my own, Casey said. He was growing more curious about what had the sergeant so on edge. Casey wasn't sure if it was his rising paranoia or the sergeant's strange behavior, but when he exited the building, he looked upon Moberly with different eyes. There was a man and a woman walking on the other side of the street, watching him intently. Was it just curiosity or something more sinister? The shop tender on the corner seemed intent on sweeping the same spot more than seemed necessary. Was he thinking something untoward? He also noticed it was quiet. Towns tended to be quieter than people said they were in the past. There were far fewer cars and people out in the streets. Everyone had somewhere to be and something to do, which contributed to less noise pollution. He wasn't sure if it was his imagination, but something felt off. He had heard rumors that the closer to the border you went, the stranger the people were. Maybe it wasn't just a rumor. He decided he would drive the perimeter of the town first to spot any potential refugees. Wrong word. Give me a sec here. He decided he would drive the perimeter of the town first to spot any potential refuges for the fugitives. He estimated if they came this way, it would be sometime during the night, and they might look for a place to hide out until morning. The outskirts of Moberly were much like all the other small towns in the country. As people were relocated, those left behind were moved closer to the town's center. It was all about safety and efficiency, but also to curb people's sense of ownership over one property or another. It was hard to feel like a house was yours if you knew it could be taken away at any moment. The result, however, were blocks of abandoned houses and businesses that were left to the ravages of nature. In days past, these derelicts would be havens for homeless or delinquents, but since everyone was given what they needed, that problem was all but solved. Casey realized that there were far too many places for the fugitives to hide. The best opportunity would be to catch them before they reached the town, but he would need a good plan to stop them with so little help. He knew that if they came through Moberly, it would be from the northeast, so he decided to look there for a place to lay an ambush that might surprise the fugitives enough to capture them. The drive across Moberly did nothing to curb his uneasiness about the strange town. He was almost relieved to reach the northeast end, where empty windows, like the vacant eyes of corpses, were all that he could see. He drove through the neighborhoods of overgrown lawns and run-down houses, thinking how lonely the homes looked. He knew it was a strange thought, but he couldn't help it. There was something almost sad about the emptiness of yards that used to be filled with playing children, and homes now devoid of loving families. At least, Casey thought, that part of town was normal. When he reached the end of the neighborhood, something caught his eye. Set back from the old farm road that headed east from the town was a large red brick building. It was about a quarter-mile from the east edge of town and surrounded by overgrown fields. It struck Casey as the perfect place for a large group of people to hide for the night. He turned the SUV onto the farm road and investigated the building. The broken pavement rumbled under the vehicle's tires as Casey put both hands on the wheel, after a particularly deep pothole caused the SUV to jerk wildly. Pulling into the old gravel drive in front of the building, Casey could see the faded paint and a cracked sign marking the place as an antique mall. He remembered them from his youth, places where people sold heirlooms, antiques, and junk from their past. They were a bit like an indoor, year-round yard sale. With the nationalization of the economy, these places became obsolete, and they were simply abandoned, as their previous owners were assigned to jobs that were actually needed. Most of these old places were looted before people came to realize there was no point in it. The lieutenant got out of the SUV and glanced around the property. Once he was closer, he realized how perfect it would be for the fugitives. With the tall grass all around and the large stand of trees on the north side of the property, a large group of people could move through without anyone seeing them. They could walk right into the broken front doors and sleep comfortably with no one the wiser. If they rose before the sun and moved on, the town of Moberly wouldn't even know they'd played host to the most wanted people in the country. Casey walked in through the broken doors and was surprised to find there had been no looting in the building. It looked much like the one from his childhood memory. He found himself standing at the beginning of a maze of cubicle-like booths filled with a plethora of artifacts from the past. The dust was thick, and as were the cobwebs. The sun shining through the broken windows created a swirl of dancing motes as his passage disturbed the dust. Most things that had been made of fabric and paper did not stand up to the elements, with no one to care for them. Animals had clearly used the building, and recently, as he stepped over the leavings of raccoons and dogs. Despite the mess and the passage of time, Casey could still catch the faint whiff of smells that reminded him of his last visit to a place like this. Oil used to clean a family's prized dining table, and musty old paper from a precious collection of books. He walked down a nearby aisle and smelled a faint hint of perfume that had permeated a bench that went with an antique dressing table, and further along a booth from a house where incense must have burned every day. He looked at the remnants of the past, and his own childhood returned to him with familiar sights and smells. All around him were examples of what America used to be, each booth like a collage of homes and the lives they had held, each so different, but all of them so much the same. He touched a porcelain tea service, imagining how proud the family must have been to have a full set. Next to that was a wooden humidor and a whiskey decanter. Opening the wooden box, he could smell the old cedar mixed with tobacco. more items someone had worked hard to afford. They reminded him of his grandparents, of how his grandfather would take a thick cigar out to the porch and sit in his rocker with a glass of amber, glass of amber alcohol while his grandmother would make tea. His mother and grandmother would sit on a couch with a floral print and watch the kids play while his father and grandfather would talk and smoke outside. They were all just things, and people were taught that to cherish things was wrong. Casey understood, though. These were more than just things to the people that had them. These things represented people's dreams and goals. Each person's dreams were different. Each goal as varied as the people that had them. It was misguided, but understandable, to value one's worth by things acquired. Those ideas were outdated in Casey's America, an America where everyone's goals were the same. The success of the whole, not the individual. Casey closed the box and shook his head. He just couldn't understand why anyone would cling to these old ideas. He looked around and felt a little sad that he had to leave, but he knew that this would be the perfect place to wait for the fugitives. He had a lot of work to do to prepare. On his way out, he saw a small metal toy car on a shelf. It was a bright red sports car, the type that many children had collected when he was younger. He picked up the car and wiped the dust off. It was the very same car he'd had in his own collection as a child. Some impulse he didn't understand made him slip the car into his pocket on the way out the door. So yeah, that scene, I actually wrote that scene after we visited. My wife and I like to go to antique malls, and I wanted to give a sense of what Middle America, what the Midwest, one of the major things that everyone in the Midwest has in common. We all have been to, or we know of, or we frequent these antique malls, and they're very common in the Midwest. If you have never been to one and you find one, you really should go, because it's a really cool way to just explore a lot of different examples of what people are in this country. And just like described in here, every booth is different, but they're all so much the same. They all hold so many similar things, but so much uniqueness that you can really start to see how a family built their life around some of these things. And I wanted a way to show Casey's sense of what he believed in contrast to that, in contrast to what things used to be. So I thought that was an important scene to show, and I wanted to show it with Casey, seeing it, because I wanted to write it through his eyes, because I thought it would give us a little bit of insight into him, his psyche, and his reason for doing what he does. So that's why I wrote that scene. That's where that comes from, and why that's there, why I think that's important. All right, chapter 29 has a long chapter header, a long excerpt. So, America has fought many wars over the years. Wars in other countries, wars on drugs and crime, war on poverty and hunger. Some had lasting positive effects, like freeing people from oppression or defending countries against savage aggressors. Some were pointless and costly, like the war on drugs. Others served a purpose more than what it seemed to be, like the war on poverty. We learned that you can't win a war against a disease unless treatment is your weapon. And a war against poverty was really only a means to make some people look good for votes. The most insidious war this country fought was not even acknowledged by one side of the fight. For many years, secular groups fought to purge religion from all public life, using words that were not even in the Constitution to justify their argument. Separation of church and state was written by a man who served in Congress that still had religious services to open each new session of the House. The secularists claimed that they only wanted freedom from religion, but it soon became a fight to tear down every public display of faith, whether it be on government property or not. No one can say when certain government powers realized that religion was one of the things keeping them from taking full power. But it was clear that the current government realized it quickly enough. Shortly after the president took emergency powers, places of worship, holy texts, and the practice of religion were all outlawed. one people with a shared goal and a shared responsibility had no need for individual faith, so they said. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. So yeah, that's just a quick one. Obviously setting the stage for why this country in this book is the way it is, and I really do think that in order for anybody to push a full totalitarian regime, it would either have to be completely completely religious and one religion takeover, or it would have to be a no religion, like an outlawed religion takeover. That's the only way you would really eliminate individuality in a group of people. As long as you allow people to worship how they want, individuality is going to be the core tenet of those people's belief, and you'll never take complete power without getting rid of that, I don't think. So that had to happen for this world to be the way it is, I think. The night of the refugees' mad flight from the federal agents, Benny and Sarah looked out from the stand of trees over the blasted landscape. So this is happening the same night that the refugees are running from the feds, being chased by the dogs. So we've actually gone back a day, sort of. We've gone back a night. Or we're looking at the night before, I should say. So Sarah and Benny looked out over a blasted landscape. The demilitarized zone that separated the Republic of Texas and America was a swath of bare ground about a mile wide, devoid of anything resembling life. The American side was marked by a high fence that ran north and south, blocking their path. A mile away, in the moonlit darkness, would be the fence on the Texas side. While the side they were on was only lightly patrolled and guarded, they knew they would still have... Oh, that's a really weird sentence. While the side they were on was a mile away, in the moonlit darkness would be the fence on the Texas side. While the side they were on was only lightly patrolled and guarded, they knew they would still have to be careful with their timing. They had quite a few children hiding behind the van that they would have to... Okay, they had quite a few children hiding behind the van that they would have to herd quickly through a breach they would have to make themselves. Okay, yeah, we need to fix that. We need to fix that sentence. That's really bad. They had quite a few children. Yeah. That they would have to herd quickly through a breach they would have to make themselves. After that, they would... No. Then they would have to cross a mile of open ground without being seen. They would have to leave the van. It would be impossible to conceal, and trying to drive it through the fence would only trigger defenses on both sides. The semblance of peace had already lasted for a few years, with little interest in returning to the fight from either side. This doesn't make sense in the context. The semblance of peace between Texas and America had already lasted for a few years, with little interest in returning to the fight from either side. I think we're going to put the comma here. The war itself had been quick and violent, but with no significant results, and thankfully no major damage too far into either territory. There had been a few places where American forces broke through into Texas, but for the most part the Texan army kept the Americans out. The Texans only pushed as far into America as it was needed to interrupt the war effort. Texas had no desire to conquer land or absorb territory, just to keep America at bay. In the end, American forces... Texas had no desire to, just to keep American forces at bay. In the end, America simply didn't have the resources. Let's say in the end, the American government simply didn't have the resources for a sustained conflict, and Texas was more than happy to put up a fence and maintain their own land. America followed suit and did something it had never done in the past: built a secure fence all around its border with a foreign country. Luckily for the refugees looking down at that fence, the feds didn't have the manpower to watch all of it all of the time. So yes, that's sort of a dig at our very porous borders. Whatever you believe, whether you believe it should be a wall or whether you believe it should just be a fence or a better controlled border, quite frankly, a porous border with a country that is not entirely that doesn't have your best interest at heart is a fault. And I'm not, and of course everybody's going to say, oh, being racist and saying all the immigrants are criminals. Nobody is saying all immigrants are criminals, or that they bring crime or that they bring drugs. But there are some that do. There are smugglers. There are people that bring drugs into the country. There are people that bring, there are criminals that have been deported that come back into this country. There is, you can't deny that fact. There are people that have been deported multiple times that commit crimes in America. They get deported and they come back, and they get caught again and they get deported again and they come back. When you have a porous border, that's what happens. And there should be more regulation. There should be more security there. Whatever that security may be, there needs to be more security, because it's a consistent problem on the border. If you lived on the border, you might understand it. The people that do live on the border, a lot of them, you know, there's that town in Texas right on the border. The crime rate in that town right on the border is astronomical, especially on the Mexican side. And it's literally just across the river from the American side. And that crime spills over. Anybody who comes across the border one way or the other is subject to that crime. So it's a thing that needs to happen one way or another. We need something more secure. And so in this particular world, they did it finally, to keep the Texans out who don't actually want to come into America, which is kind of interesting. 45 minutes, Sarah said, as they both watched a military patrol vehicle drive along the road that bordered the fence. She put the old watch back into her pocket, and Benny nodded. Let's get the kids. That truck should be out of sight by the time we get back, Benny said. He was nervous about the next part. Some of the children were very young, and 45 minutes wasn't a lot of time to wrangle them all through the fence and far enough across the open ground to avoid detection. All it would take is one mishap, and it would be all over for them. They got to the van and herded the kids out into the night. The older ones helped the younger. So I've neglected that there are some adults with this group. There's just a few. The few adults in the group were older. And less pale. Older and not as healthy as... I didn't spell. Okay, and this wants a hyphen. So with them is a group of adults who they put the elderly and the people who were struggling with the march, so to speak, in the van with the kids. So it's a packed tight van, and now they have all these people that have to be pushed across the border, and hopefully nobody gets hurt. They got the van and herded the kids out into the night. The older ones helped the younger, some having to be carried. Benny grabbed the old wire cutters and metal wire he had picked up in an abandoned barn a few miles back. All right, everyone listen, Sarah said. She knelt down so she could speak to the children on their level. I need everyone... Ooh, hold on. Oh, we don't need to fix grammar and somebody's... Okay. I need everyone to stay close and stay quiet. This is the most important part of our mission. Soon after leaving the group, she had told the children they were on a secret mission to help their parents. It had the desired effect of keeping them calm and focused instead of thinking about how much they missed their families. I need to use the bathroom, a little red-haired girl said, her hand high in the air. Be quick, Gail, Sarah said, nodding to the trees. The girl rushed off. We have to hurry, Benny said urgently. Go. We'll be right behind, Sarah said. Okay, kiddos, it's time for us to be sneaky, Benny said, gesturing for the kids to follow. They all lined up behind the big man like little soldiers on parade. Most were grinning ear to ear like it was some kind of big adventure. Benny envied them their youthful innocence. They reached the edge of the trees, and Benny signaled for them all to wait there and keep quiet. He crossed the gravel road alone with wire cutters and wire in hand. He took one last look up and down the fence line, but only saw outpost lights in the distance. He thanked God for the complacency the feds had fallen into. Benny started at the bottom of the chain-link fence and pressed the old wire cutters against the galvanized link. They were not bolt cutters, but like Benny would have preferred, but he figured they would do the job with enough effort. Even with all his strength, however, it was a slow process. The dull, rusty blades on the cutters made it necessary to use all the force he could muster, and that made him worried that he might damage them before he was through. He moved slowly up the fence, praying he would have the time to make an opening large enough for them to get through. How's it going? Sarah asked, crouching down next to Benny after getting Gail back to the group. Slow. What's our time? Sarah pulled the old watch out of her pocket and checked it. 30 minutes since the truck passed, she reported. Start getting them lined up. This will be close. We're going to make that a contraction. This'll be close. Benny didn't look up and continued cutting his... Benny, we're going to take that out. Benny continued cutting as he spoke. Sarah called the children over and started lining them up near the hole in the fence. She could see that it was already large enough for her and the kids, but it would still be a tight squeeze for the large man and some of the... For her and the others. She looked up and down the road while she worked. Benny, she said, her quiet voice was a little shaky. I see headlights. Benny looked up from his work and followed her gaze. In the distance, two small points of light were coming along the road. They weren't close enough to illuminate the group, but it wouldn't be long. He made a quick decision. Dropping the cutters, he held open the hole in the fence. Miss Sarah, I left Sonny in the van, a little girl said from the back of the line. What do you mean, Kayla? Who's Sonny? Sarah asked. My bear. He's not here. I need him. The little girl started to cry, and Sarah moved to her. Hush now, child. We can't go back. Sonny wants to be brave. We have to keep going. Want you to be brave. We have to keep going. Sarah soothed the child. Kayla seemed to calm down as Sarah talked to her quietly. The woman finally convinced the child that they could not go back and that they would find a new bear when they got to Texas. Quickly now, kiddos, Benny said, pulling the first child through the gap of the fence. I want you all to go through there and run as fast as you can. Don't stop until you reach the other side. The children started filing through and ran once they were on the other side. Once the last child was through... Benny pulled Sarah toward the fence. You need to hurry. I can't make the hole any larger, Sarah said. You need to hurry. I can help make the hole larger, Sarah said. No time, Sarah. You need to catch up to the kids and get them as far from the fence as you can, Benny said. What about you? I'll make sure they don't see the hole tonight. You'll need all the time I can give you, Benny said. I need to fix these contractions. Helping the stunned woman crawl through the gap in the fence. She didn't resist as much as she wanted to. On the other side, she stood and grabbed the links. Benny, you need to get through here. I need your help, she pleaded with the bearded man. You're running out of time, Sarah. Those kids need you. I misspelled Sarah's name a couple of times in here, and I need to figure out how it's supposed to be spelled. I need to make a note of that to... hold on. Let me just do this. Let me mark where we're at. I'm going to highlight this real quick. And let's see here. We want to Control F, find all Sarah references, and yeah, I did it a handful of times. That's not good. I wonder if I can do Sarah. No, because what I'm afraid of is it's not going to go through and replace with Sarah. See, what I'm afraid of is that it's going to add 2 H's to all the ones that I did spell right. Oh, that sucks. Oh, okay, there we go. Find whole words only. Let's replace all. All done. Okay. Alright, good. Now let's find where we were. Okay, so we are a ways. Whoa. Dog sitting up, staring at the corner. Alright, so we're running out of time, sir. Those kids need you. Benny was already using the wire to close the hole in the fence. Benny, we're so close. She tried one more time. The man just shook his head, passing her the cutters. Time to go, Sarah. Get those kids home, Benny said. Sarah gave the large man one last look, her heart in her eyes. He wouldn't look back at her, knowing he had to steel himself if he was going to pull off the ruse to come. Those guards would see him soon, and he had to make sure they didn't notice the damage to the fence. He sighed in relief when he heard her footsteps rushing away. He finished wiring the fence closed, the hole closed. Let's say that, the hole closed, and stood up. Just as he turned to look up the road, the headlights of the patrol truck fell on him. He was relieved to see the spotlight was also turned in his direction and not out across the DMZ. Hold it right there, an amplified voice called from the truck. Benny stepped away from the fence with his hands on his head. The passenger door opened and a soldier in a forest camouflage fatigue stepped out, armed with an assault rifle. The soldier slowly approached. What are you doing out here, citizen? The soldier asked when he got close. My car broke down. Looking for a gas station, Benny said. He gestured as he talked, pointing off into the woods. The soldier turned and looked where he pointed, and Benny bolted. He hoped he could lead the men away long enough to give Sarah and the kids more time. He hadn't counted on the soldier's quick thinking. Benny was fairly sure he wouldn't shoot him, but he was carrying a Benny was fairly sure they wouldn't shoot him, but one was carrying a taser and didn't hesitate to use it. Alright, so yeah, that's not a bad sentence. And now we're on to chapter 30. Okay, before we start chapter 30, I'm going to take a quick break. Use the restroom and some water. So give me just a minute and I will be right back. have anything for you. Okay, go lay down. All right. Let's see here. We are on chapter 30 now. I was very young when my grandmother died. She was special to all of us, but at the time I felt like it hurt me worse. I imagine everyone feels that way when they lose someone special. She was always in my memories, with a smile and a laugh, looking at her grandkids like they were the most important people in the world. That's how we felt when we visited her. I remember being angry when she passed. I was angry about all the years that would never be, all the things in my life she would miss, and all the things we would no longer share. I directed all of that anger at God, thinking that if he was so good, why did he take her from us? I imagine it was difficult for my father, but he set aside his grief to try and explain something as vague as God's plan to an angry little boy. In the end, he said that life would always be hard. There would always be obstacles in the way or things that would hurt us, and we must have faith. It's hard to trust someone you don't know, someone you can't see or hear, but we have to trust. When God holds out his hand, we must take it and trust that he knows what he is doing. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. All right. John limped along with the group, headed west through the trees parallel to the highway. Several times someone in the group suggested they stop so he could rest, but he refused to slow down everyone else for his sake. Amanda only asked once, but even then she knew he would refuse. She's laying there watching the door now. After that, she just kept close, offering her hand or shoulder when he seemed to need it. What does it want here? Add comma between. Amanda only asked once, but even then she knew he would refuse. No, that's right. Huh. After Steve's death and the close calls of the last couple of days, John wasn't going to risk any more of his friends by delaying any longer than they had to. Recalling the map in his head, John hoped they could make it to Moberly before dark. Amanda had warned him about the SUV that passed them, and he had a good idea who was driving it. He prayed that Casey would wait there for them so they could skirt the town and get ahead of him again. He knew they had enough supplies to stop in the next town. He knew they had enough supplies. Wait, what? He knew they had enough supplies. So stopping in the next town wouldn't be necessary. He was acutely aware of how lucky they were with their last encounter with the federal agents and didn't want to press that luck anytime soon. Before stopping for lunch, they had to cross to the north side of Highway 24 to avoid the small town of Paris. There wasn't much left in the town, but they could still see a few signs of its residents. Doesn't make sense to put a comma there. Before stopping for lunch, they had to cross the north side. Yeah. Not sure that needs a comma. Doesn't sound right. When they stopped for lunch, the groups moved deeper into the trees to reduce the risk of being seen by a passing car. They were getting good at settling down quickly, finding space under trees or in shadows so they wouldn't be seen from the air. Everyone knew the routine: silence and efficiency. Eat what they needed as fast as they could with no noise. Leaving no trace was crucial, so there were always 2 or 3 people assigned to sweep the area for missed garbage and to try to disguise any sign they had stopped there. After the short break, they were on the move again, leaving the concealing stand of trees near an abandoned farmhouse. A few people were selected to walk between the groups and the highway. Their job was to listen and watch for cars on the road. If any were detected, they would signal and the entire group would crouch in the tall grass or behind trees. So far, they had seen very few vehicles since leaving Illinois. After a little over an hour, they came within sight of a town straddling the highway. Madison, one of the spotters reported after seeing the sign. Looks like we'll have to go around. North or south, it doesn't look like it matters, John said. They decided not to cross the highway and continued around the north side of Madison. John hoped the overgrown fields and stands of trees would conceal them from anyone that might be looking in that direction. Moving through the fields on the north side of the town, the group was spread out to help avoid detection. John and Amanda were in the lead. John's limp had worsened, but his ankle was mostly numb by then. He still felt twinges from time to time, but mostly it was a dull ache. I'm going to take out that mostly. They could tell they were getting close to one of the northbound country roads, so they slowed down to let the others catch up. John signaled them to wait there, and the hand motion was passed down the line. He approached the road on his own. John walked out of the field slowly, just far enough to see both ways along the road. He spent several seconds watching and waiting. He couldn't see anything moving in either direction, so he approached the road, approached the pavement. When he reached the old broken asphalt, something did move. Under the shade of a tree, 100 yards south of him, someone stood up. John thought the person was looking in his direction, but was sure of it when the figure waved. He couldn't run with his ankle and didn't want to lead the stranger to the others, so he stayed where he was while the stranger walked toward him. Didn't. Just passing through? The stranger asked with a knowing smile when he got close enough to be heard. John could tell he was just a kid, no more than 18 or 19 years old. Yeah, car broke down, John lied. He never liked having to lie, but sometimes it was the only way to protect others. You're John, right? The boy asked. John was taken aback by the question. He looked around, expecting federal agents to come pouring out of the fields any second. He had nowhere to go, and he knew he was in no shape to run. The boy recognized his discomfort immediately. Relax, I'm not with the feds. We've been hearing about you all on the radio, the boy said. The radio? I didn't expect the feds to make it public. John didn't see the need for any more lies. Not the federal stations. They never tell the truth. We built one that picks up broadcasts out of Texas. You're famous, John, the boy said. Now John understood the knowing smile and the starstruck look in the boy's eyes. We? John asked, on guard again. Yeah, a few of us got together when we heard about the group that left Illinois. We've been talking about running for months, but when we heard about you on the news, we decided to wait. We figured you might come this way. We have kids living in every town near here watching for you, the boy said. Watching for me? John wasn't sure if he should be worried or thankful. There was too much at risk to believe everything a strange kid said. Why don't I just show you? The barn's not far. Everyone will be excited to meet you. John looked back toward the field, unsure which way to turn. This could be genuine Providence, or it could be a Fed trap. John, I know you don't know me, but you can trust me, the kid said, holding out his hand. John was struck by the scene and the words the kid spoke. They were words he remembered from his childhood, words that had struck him, words that had stuck with him. He saw a fork in their path and a stranger offering a helping hand. He saw one of the paths was difficult, broken, and rough, with a gaping chasm blocking the way. The other path was easy, smooth, and led back the way they came. This boy was offering a hand to help along that hard path. Something inside him shouted that he take the hand, trust this stranger. John reached out and took the kid's hand and shook it. You already know my name. What's yours? John asked. Jeff, the boy said. Give me a minute, Jeff. I'll get the others. John couldn't help but feel a shadow of doubt about all of this. Despite having just said he would trust Jeff, he knew that is exactly what it meant to have faith, to take that leap despite your doubts. He believed, like his father had, that a person had to trust in something greater than themselves. He valued the importance of self-reliance and independence, but he recognized people could accomplish much more together. Amanda looked askance at John when he got back to the group. He could see the rest were close enough to hear, but still spread out in case they needed to get away fast. He looked at them for a moment, feeling his decision weighing on him. If his judgment wasn't sound, he was endangering everyone around him. There was no doubt in their eyes, and that realization humbled him yet again. They knew him, knew his faults and weaknesses, and they put their faith in him. "We're going to meet some people. I think they might be coming with us," John said. "The kid?" Amanda asked. She had been curious and moved close enough to see them while the two talked. "Yes, there are others as well. They have news from Texas," John said. "Oh, now the dog wants out. All right, give me a minute. I'll take another quick break. Let the dog out." All right, buddy. Let's go outside. Well, he's taking his sweet time, so we will keep going while he sits outside. We'll wait till he barks, and then we'll let him in. Alright, so where are we at? 5:20. Alright. He couldn't have said anything that would have had a greater effect on them. The only news they had of Texas, other than rumor, was the government's sterilized propaganda. They were all making the move based on rumor and hearsay. To have real news was more than any of them could hope for. "You trust him, John?" Todd asked. There was no doubt in his voice, only a straightforward question from a friend. "Yes, I do," John nodded. "Good enough for me," Todd said, moving toward the road without another word. Everyone else followed. The group fell into their usual pattern after crossing the farm road. They were excited to hear the news, but understood the danger of losing their discipline. John and Jeff led the group west across the fields. They could all see the large barn ahead, standing ominous and silent in the middle of the overgrown field. It leaned slightly and was missing its wooden skin in places where time had won out. When they got close, the doors opened and several young people, appearing to range in age from 15 to 20, stepped out of the building. "John, they're just kids," Amanda said. "So it would seem," John agreed. Jeff approached a girl standing in the doorway who looked to be the oldest, waving John over to join them. "Jennifer, this is John Everman," Jeff introduced him. At the announcement, most of the kids rushed forward to shake hands or hug members of John's group. Jennifer took John's offered hand and shook it firmly. There was a sense of relief among the kids that made John realize how much they had been holding out hope for contact with his group. "We weren't sure you would come this way. Heck, we weren't even sure the stories were real," Jennifer explained. "You mean the radio broadcast out of Texas?" John asked. She nodded. "We would like to hear them," Todd said from John's left. "You can soon. They broadcast in the evening, and we can usually pick it up." While they talked, John noticed a few kids running off in different directions and a couple riding on old bicycles that they must have scavenged and repaired. John became nervous again. "Where are they going?" he asked. "To get the others," Jennifer replied. Jeff told you that we've been waiting and watching for you. We have people scattered all over. They can't leave without it. We can't leave without everyone. Look, Jennifer, we don't plan on staying. Our kids are waiting for us. We have to keep moving, John said. While he talked, he looked around at his own group and saw doubt in their eyes. When his gaze settled on his wife, he knew his initial reaction had been the wrong one. John, we have to come with you. Jennifer started to appeal, but he held up a hand to stop her. I spoke too hastily, it seems, John said. I don't know what I was thinking. Of course we will wait. Of course we'll wait. And take all of you with us. Jeff, who had been waiting with bated breath to mount his own bicycle, smiled and climbed onto the rusty old bike to pedal away. Of course. Yeah, that does need a comma. You were thinking about your kids, I understand, Jennifer said. Looking around at the way the other kids looked up to her, he believed she did understand. We can't wait long, though, John said. Don't worry, no one is more than a couple hours away, Jennifer said. Jennifer explained. If we're staying, we better get inside, Amanda said. Right. Come inside, it's safe, and we have some food. Jennifer stood back to let them pass. The children sprang into action in the excited chaos that always overtakes others sprang into action in the excited chaos that always overtakes children when there is a large gathering. They led the adults into the barn with excited chatter and smiles. Some rushed to the back to retrieve ration packs they must have brought from town and fruit found in the area. It turned into an impromptu celebration as makeshift tables were constructed out of bales and wooden planks, and the food was spread out for everyone. John, Todd, and Amanda followed Jennifer toward the back of the barn where she said the radio was. One of the other children brought food back to them. That was the dog summoning. Be right back. Alright, where are we at? We got 30 more minutes or so. Get out from under there. Hey, you don't belong under there. Get. Always goes under my desk. Go lay down. You got a bed right there. Alright. The radio was a collection of old electronics, wire, lights, and dials. John could see a couple of old books about radio building and operation on the table, and a box of scavenged tools under it. It appears as if they had gathered every antique electronic device they could find and wired them together into a sort of Frankenstein's monster of a radio. Next to the device was a large metal box with several wires running to the radio and a cranking lever on the side. I need to fix large metal box with several wires running to the running to the device and a cranking lever on the side. We hooked it up to the old antenna on the roof, and that there, she pointed to the box with the crank, is how we power it. She moved over to the crank and started to turn it. The task seemed difficult at first, as Jennifer seemed to use all of her strength to start the crank, but once it started, it seemed to get easier. John could hear the whirring sound inside that reminded him of the old toy cars that were powered by pulling them back to wind up the motor and releasing it to speed away. From what I've read, I believe the man who used to run this farm was a ham radio operator. One of those books describes the equipment and the antenna that we found as the kind of stuff they used to use, Jennifer explained as she cranked the generator. Why did you start building this in the first place? John asked. For fun, mostly. A couple of the neighborhood boys found the old radio behind a wall in the barn a couple of summers ago. One of them, Jeff, is my brother, and he brought me out here to show me. As we worked on it, more of the kids came out, and before long it was a sort of club, Jennifer said. She stopped cranking the box and moved to the radio, flipping switches and turning dials. Lights on the displays flickered on the static filled the barn as the radio came to life. The girl adjusted dials and picked up a headset to listen more closely. Her eyes took on a distant look as she concentrated, obviously searching for a faint signal in the white noise. The others kept silent, almost holding their breath as she worked, not wanting to disturb her concentration. Finally, she smiled and put down the headset, moving to another dial to make more adjustments. The white noise had changed. They could all now hear someone's voice low and quiet in the background, buried in the static. They never broadcast on the same frequency, and sometimes it's hard to get the signal. It's not always the best quality, but if I can get this adjusted just right, we should be able to hear it, Jennifer said. If you can hear my voice, old America, take heart. You are not alone. The voice cut through the static. It was a man's voice, and clearly one accustomed to being on the radio. It was the kind of voice that John remembered from his youth, listening to news broadcasts. On the television, he wouldn't have listened to him on the radio. He's not that old. From all reports, John Everman and his people are still free and on their way to the border. Our sources inside the old country have assured me that they have not been captured, and the effort to stop them has met with more setbacks. The agents in pursuit have gone home for the weekend, as is their contractual agreement with the government. It's just another example of the problems faced by our brothers and sisters still trapped in that oppressive country. At the mention of his name, everyone looked at John, and suddenly he was embarrassed. He wasn't fond of being the center of attention, even among his friends and family. Even the children were staring at him, though their looks were more along the lines of fans caught up in meeting their idol. He liked that even less. I have grand news to share with you, my friends. A very special guest is with me today. She has just arrived from old America with a very special package, so to speak, the man continued. The children seemed excited about the announcement. They kept their cheers subdued, but they cheered all the same. It's always big news when someone makes it out, Jennifer whispered. Miss, I believe you wanted to say a few words, the man on the radio asked. Yes, The woman's voice was quiet, and she hesitated. It was obvious that she was nervous. It's all right, miss. No need to be nervous, the man's voice said. Sit forward and speak normally into the mic. My name is Sarah. All the newcomers to the barn sat up, suddenly recognizing the voice that went with the name. If anyone sees John and the rest, or if any of them are listening now. Sarah's voice caught in her throat as she held back the emotions of her ordeal in the hope that her friends were still safe and well. John, if you're out there listening, we made it. All of the children made it with me. We're here waiting for you. The crowd in the barn erupted into cheers and shouts, but John leaned forward and tilted his head to the speaker. Sarah wasn't finished. We made it, John, but they have Benny. He made sure we could get away, and they have... The signal died in static. Alright. So that should give us that sense of something's wrong, sense of urgency. I'm going to check some messages real quick. Give my voice a minute. My voice, just a minute. Oh, I left my water in the other room. That's a problem. Ooh. Looking like rain outside. Alright, I just want to check a couple things and make sure there aren't any new... All the messages I get are important. I want to see if there's anything new. Nothing new. Frozen over here on Mixer. Let me reboot that. Mixer seems to have more and more trouble the last couple of days. And it's just stopped broadcasting to me. Oh, there we go. Huh, okay. Alright, so we're all good. Okay, good. Alright, chapter 31. I remember my grandfather talking about the core difference between a progressive and himself. He was speaking to a man at a restaurant about government regulation. The man said the government needed to regulate because people couldn't be trusted to do the right thing. My grandfather asked the man if he believed people couldn't govern themselves, and the man nodded. The man pointed out all the terrible things people did out of greed, jealousy, or hate. Grandfather just shook his head and walked away without another word. Later I asked him if the man was right, if people were too bad to be free. Was the man right? Doubled up. Okay. My grandfather explained that the man's view was entirely opposed to the spirit of the American experiment. He said that all those bad things were done by just a few when most people were good and honest. Just a few. And most people were good and honest. He explained that government is meant to facilitate man ruling himself, not to take the place of that idea. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. Casey arrived back at the federal police station to find the place a hub of excited activity. The sergeant and a group of men, the volunteers Casey assumed, were bent over a map and talking about where the fugitives might come through town. The lieutenant walked over to the table and put his finger down about as close to the location of the antique mall as he could guess. They'll come through here sometime after dark if they come this way. It's where I would hide out if I were them. Lieutenant, these are the most reliable citizens that I could round up, the sergeant said by way of introduction. Ah, crap. Just gotta hold out for 20 more minutes. Voice. Good. We'll want to get everyone out to that site. There's an abandoned building that can be seen from quite a distance. They're sure to see it. We'll station some of you in the nearby fields just in case, Casey explained. The volunteers filed out of the station to wait for transportation to the property at the sergeant's direction. The sergeant started to leave with them, but stopped and pulled a small piece of paper out of his shirt pocket. Lieutenant, you got a call while you were out. Some Army officer down at one of the border posts. Casey was thankful the sergeant wrote down the officer's name and number instead of just some Army officer. Did he say what it was about? Casey asked. I didn't ask. Great, thanks, Casey growled in irritation. He waved the local officer off in dismissal. After the sergeant was gone, Casey sat at the desk and dialed the number on the paper. It was answered by the duty officer, and Casey asked for Captain Green. Captain Green, a deep voice said after Casey waited a couple of minutes on hold. This is Lieutenant Casey, FPC. I had a message that you called. Right, Casey. You've been a tough man to track down, Green said. What can I do for you, Captain? Casey asked. I thought you might want to know that we found one of your station's vans and one of your fugitives, Green reported. Just one? I'm not sure how you could possibly have one of the ones I'm looking for. Can you brief me from the beginning, Captain? Casey said, completely confused by the turn of events. Green explained the events from the previous night. He described Benny, but could not confirm his identity. They tracked ownership of the van found by the patrol, and after a series of phone calls located Casey. From the description, Casey knew the prisoner had to be the one called Bernard Saunders, but he couldn't begin to imagine why the man had taken the van to the border on his own unless it was meant to be a distraction. Even as the thought crossed his mind, though, he knew they couldn't have timed it so perfectly. Benny's capture, so close to when Casey had the rest, and the rest should next cross paths, had to be pure coincidence. He was sure of it. I have something I need to handle tonight, but I'll be down there first thing in the morning, Casey said. Casey left the station a little less sure of his plan than he'd been before. There were so many things that could go wrong. The appearance of the missing van and one fugitive at the border only served to bring that fact to the forefront of Casey's mind. He couldn't imagine they sent one of their own on ahead to distract him, but he had underestimated them in the past. He couldn't imagine they sent one of their own on ahead one of their own ahead to distract him, but he had underestimated them in the past. The group was waiting for him. The volunteers were waiting for him on the sidewalk outside the station. None of the volunteers had cars, so they piled into the sergeant's van. Casey led the way out to the edge of town, and they parked near an abandoned house so the vehicles wouldn't be seen from the fields. Once out of the van, they all gathered around the ranking federal officer. "You two, I want you over there." He pointed to a spot that would put them about a quarter-mile west of the antique mall. "Spread out and keep your eyes and ears open." They nodded and rushed off toward the indicated spot. "You," Casey pointed at another man, "I want you about halfway between them and the building." After the men rushed off to his spot, the lieutenant looked over to the rest. Considering the numbers he had to work with, there were trees closer to the east side of the abandoned building, so he placed 2 more men on that side, one at the tree line and one between him and the building. That left Casey, the sergeant, and 5 others to watch the building itself. "You two will watch the front." Casey indicated 2 of the remaining volunteers and pointed at the main doors on the south side of the building. "We'll watch the back." Casey led the sergeant and the last volunteer around to the north side of the building. There was a back door and a couple of ground-level windows that someone could use to get in. He spread the 2 men out so they covered as much of the property's north side as they could. The sun was starting to set, and Casey settled down to wait out the long night. Pulled a small handheld radio out of his pocket. Each man in the party carried one, just like it. "Radio check. Respond from west to east," Casey said after keying up the radio. After a few minutes of confusion, the volunteers finally understood and started responding to verify their radios were working and on the correct channel. Once they had all checked in, Casey keyed his own handset again. "Stay awake and stay quiet. If you see anything, report it on the radio immediately. Otherwise, keep radio silence," the lieutenant said. He was surprised and thankful there were no responses. They were following orders without question, which is more than he could have hoped for. Alone in the gathering darkness, Casey listened to the sounds of the world around him settling in for the night. He couldn't remember the last time he had actually listened to the birds calling to each other or noticed the ebb and flow to the sounds of insects in the evening. He was used to the city, and even there he was always too busy to even listen to that. There was a certain peacefulness to the cacophony. There was a certain peace. Peacefulness? There was a certain peace to the cacophony around him, and something buried deep inside relished that. He leaned back against the small tree and watched the darkening fields before him. His hand found the small metal car in his pocket, and his thumb rubbed the enamel paint slowly. It seemed strange to him that he was more relaxed and at peace here, alone, an individual in the dark, than he was anywhere else. He'd been taught to think about the collective, the betterment of everyone as a group, but at that moment all Casey wanted was to be left alone with his own thoughts and feelings. It was a strange sensation, and it made him feel a little guilty, but he couldn't help it. Through the long hours of the night, the lieutenant thought about those feelings. He imagined it was how John and the fugitives must feel and why they were on the run. That realization didn't make it right in Casey's mind, but it explained it in terms he could understand. They were still criminals as far as he was concerned, shirking their responsibility to the state and their fellow citizens. He was sure a few months in re-education would correct their behavior, once he managed to arrest them. That was likely to be their sentence, though harsher penalties had been used for these cases in the past. As the hours passed, Casey began to worry that something had gone wrong. He was sure they would come this way. Since Moberly was the next logical place on their route. He figured they would stick close to major roads to avoid getting lost, but wondered if they might have risked cutting across cutting cross-country after their last encounter with him. If they were now avoiding the highway or towns, it would make it harder for him to find them. When pre-dawn started to lighten the sky, Casey was sure something wasn't right. Somehow the fugitives had either known he was waiting, or they had changed direction as a precaution. He knew there was no point in waiting any longer or searching elsewhere. He could drive every road in the area and never find them. He stood up and went looking for the sergeant. Something's wrong. They aren't coming this way. Casey said, handing over his radio. Dismiss everyone. We're done here. I'm heading south to look for something I can use. The sergeant took the radio and nodded. Casey didn't wait for any acknowledgement. He made his way to the SUV parked up the road, deep in thought. He had to get information he could use out of the prisoner the army was holding, if it was even one of the ones he was looking for. If it was Bernard, Casey was determined to get him to talk, find out why he was down there on his own, and what might have happened to the others. Okay. What are we, 5:45? I think I'm going to go ahead and cut the show here with Chapter 32. So we've made it a good distance. We're over halfway done now. That didn't mark. There we go. Okay, Chapter 32 marked, saved. Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for joining me. If you did watch the live show, if you're watching the recording, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think of the show. I welcome anybody's comments, critique, whatever you have to say. Saturday, we will be doing Saturday randomness rather than our episode of Shattered. Excuse me, there's the new Guild Wars 2 Living Story released this week, so we will be starting that. So we're going to break up our normal show with a special Guild Wars 2 show. Maybe two of them, depends on how long the Living Story lasts. And then we'll get back to Shattered after that. Monday Night Classics will be going on as normal. And you guys stay cool out there. It's been a warm week in my area, and it's going to be a hot weekend. 4th of July coming up. I'm off on the 4th, but I don't know if I have plans for a special stream. We'll see. It depends on how my day is scheduled that day. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I had a lot of fun. I hope you did too. And we will see you next time. You guys have a great one. Much love.